So this talk this morning is about Ripleyville, which is quite different from a lot of the other neighbourhoods that we've talked about so far. In really so far as the other areas more or less sprung up, you could say organically, you know, probably rapidly because of a lack of planning controls and building regulations and things like that. As where Ripleyville was designed and planned from the beginning, the whole purpose behind it was to create a new community. Is Ripleyville a name that people are familiar with? Yeah. Anybody not familiar with Ripleyville? Okay. Anyone else not familiar? Okay. It does tend to be one of the more well-known of the former districts compared to some of the others we've talked about. So, Ripleyville, which sometimes gets split into two words, Ripleyville, it was named after Henry William Ripley. He was an industrialist and he was a politician. He's also quite often regarded as being a philanthropist, depending upon your point of view. Ripley was responsible for the creation of this neighbourhood, and it was a model industrial village. So the idea behind its conception was to provide better housing for the working classes. So the area that Ripleyville covered was technically part of the Broomfields district, which we talked about in a previous session. So Broomfields district is to the south of where the interchange is now, around a sort of Hall Lane, Prospect Street area. And Ripleyville was built arguably within the boundaries of Broomfields. Its boundaries were sort of Hall Lane to the north, Ellen Street to the west, Ripley Terrace to the south, and then the railway line to the east. And as I said at the beginning, unlike the other neighbourhoods that we've talked about, Ripleyville was actually designed and planned from the very start. So the other places we've talked about, like Longlands and Silsbridge Lane and Wapping, basically just sort of more or less organically developed and expanded, and quite often carried on expanding over years, as where with Ripleyville there was an actual plan right from the start. And it was Bradford's first and arguably Bradford's only example of an industrial model village, because Saltaire was built in Shipley and Shipley was not part of Bradford back then. I would imagine a lot of people who live in Shipley would say Shipley's still not part of Bradford, really.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so Ripleyville really is Bradford's model village. So, by the 1860s, Ripley was the managing partner of Bowling Dye Works, which was founded by his grandfather in 1808. And as it says here, he'd been a junior partner since 1835, but he was generally regarded as the boss of the dye house. So he was the face of the dye house, and he really helped the business to become arguably the largest dye works in Yorkshire. And Ripley was recognised as one of the big four industrialists in Bradford. So as Ripley, Salt, Lister, and Holden. And he was on Bradford Corporation as a councillor, and he was a Justice of the Peace as well. So he was involved in public life as well as being a businessman. Now, a lot of people give words of warning about Ripley because the likes of Salt and Lister had personal biographers, so they had people who were actually documenting things that they were doing and capturing historical events. Ripley never had a biographer, so information concerning Ripley comes from various different sources. Some of those sources probably reliable, some of those sources definitely not reliable. So you have to take a lot of information with a lot of salt, really. Right, so just a little bit of background about the model industrial village movement. So a lot of sources claim that Ripley's activities were motivated by this sense of philanthropy that he had, that he wanted to do something to improve living conditions for the working classes in Bradford. And the model village movement was something that was of this time. Now, the origins of the movement are not entirely clear. There's some people that say they started with the landed gentry, who basically decided to demolish houses on their estates because they spoilt the view from the manor house, and then they just rebuild them somewhere that you couldn't see. Which is something I actually touched on in the first session, the Longland session, when I talked about the different reasons why neighbourhoods and villages have disappeared over the centuries. And one of them was definitely something called emparking, where you would get landowners who decided they didn't want a village that was on their estate there anymore, for no reason other than they prefer there to be an ornate garden there instead. So I've got to an age now where words just disappear. Where's the place called that they film Emmerdale?
Eschol.
No, they moved from Eschol a long time ago.
Harewood, yeah.
Harewood House. Harewood House. Right, the village of Harewood that we know today is not the original village of Harewood. It was originally much closer to the manor house, but it was demolished. And it was demolished because they didn't want to look at it. So thankfully, they did rebuild it, and it's quite a nice village, I would say. I would say it's quite an aesthetically pleasing village. Quite a lot of landed gentry decided just to demolish the houses and evict their tenants, and didn't think that they had any responsibility for creating new homes for them. Anyway, some people think that that was the beginnings of the model village movement, but there are examples of it definitely being about improving housing conditions. So there was New Lanark, which there's a picture of here, which is in Scotland, which is generally considered to be the first model village. So this was built in 1785, known by Robert Owen. Did you say you've been there?
Yeah.
We have been there.
What did you think when you went? Was it impressive?
It was impressive, yes. It's well out of the way.
Where it was.
Okay, right. It looks nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did the buildings look like they were well built?
Yes, they did look well built.
Right.
They didn't look old though.
They stood a long time.
Right. Well, yes. Yeah. It's still there now.
They're still there, exactly, so they can't be that bad.
No. Although perhaps a lot of that's to do with people actually spending money on maintaining them and
Probably,
keeping them.
Well,
'Cause they were-
no building lasts if it's not maintained.
Yes, exactly. Which we will find out in a while about Ripleyville. So, there are other examples, some famous ones. Bourneville, that the Cadbury family are responsible for, near Birmingham. Anybody been to Bourneville?
Sorry,
Yeah.
Jonathan, could I just ask, like this Bourneville and Ripleyville, is the Ville part of it mean village?
Yes.
Is it French or something?
I think it is French. Yes.
Ah.
It'll be a legacy from when the Normans
Okay.
decided to come across here. Well, come across here is a light way of putting it.
Yeah,
Invaded us.
yeah.
Yes, so that's where it comes from. There's Princeville in Bradford, I think, which was
Princeville, yes,
very-
there is.
yeah, there's quite a lot. Port Sunlight near Birkenhead, which sort of going towards Merseyside area.
Except they don't say Birkenhead, they say Wirral.
Do they say Wirral?
They do the Wirral.
Okay, I stand corrected. Okay. Port Sunlight near Wirral.
Yeah.
Where's the witch in the Wirral?
In the Wirral.
And there are more local examples to Bradford. So there's Ackroydon in Booth Town, which is now in part of Halifax. And of course there's Saltaire. Ackroydon was built in 1875 and is still intact as far as I understand. And Saltaire's doing quite well. It was built the year after. It's certain that the plans for some of these places, like Saltaire and Ackroydon, influenced Ripley. So they may not have got off the ground at those points, but definitely these other industrialists will have been making it public what their intentions were. As we've said in previous sessions, Salt, it looks as though Salt didn't necessarily want to come to Shipley to begin with. There is evidence that he wanted to go to Skipton to build his village, and then he looked at other sites like Burley and Wharfdale and even Knaresborough. But there would have been the plans, there would have been the idea, long before the site was finalised. So this will have rubbed off on Ripley. So, 1865, the Bolling Dye Works had more than 80 acres of land that was unbuilt on, and this had been mine works. I'm not sure if it was coal or iron ore mine works, but they'd been exhausted, so this land was now going surplus, so it was available for development. So, you want to build a village, why not use the land that you already own? So, 1866, Bradford Corporation granted planning permission for him to build 254 houses on this land that was adjacent to the Bolling Dye Works. This is a time when all the neighbourhoods that we've talked about before, you've got a mix of densely packed back-to-back terraces, and you've got mills and factories practically next door. Nearly everybody will have just walked a short distance to work from home. So the idea of having housing so close to the dye works wasn't controversial at all. In this setting, it was regarded as pretty common and usual. It's not something I would particularly like myself. The year after the planning was amended, Ripley decided he wanted to reduce this now to 200 houses because he wanted to include a school on the site. So this will have been an elementary education school, basic maths, basic English and religious instruction. All the houses were completed by 1868 and the school was used later that year. Ripley himself wasn't involved in the management of the school. He got an existing charitable organisation, the British and Foreign School Society, to come in and manage it. And they were a non-denominational charity, so there wasn't a particular leaning towards, any religion. I would still imagine there would have been a little bit of an Anglican theme. And that's probably borne out in some other stuff that happens later on in Ripleyville. So the architecture of the houses was terrace houses, but there were through terraces, which was really unusual at that time. So from the first session I did about the lost neighbourhoods, when we looked at Longlands, which was allegedly the worst of the districts, the slum districts in Bradford. The through terraces that were built initially to house the residents at Faxfleet near Odsall and Marshfields, people thought they were palatial compared to the conditions that they'd been in. So there was an idea, and this is earlier on from when Longlands was finally demolished, because that was the turn of the 20th century. So this is much earlier on. It's quite radical in many respects, locally at least. All the houses had 2 attic bedrooms, 2 first floor bedrooms and a cellar, but the ground floor layout varied. There was 3 types of housing, which we'll go on to in a minute. I thought I was going to go on to it now. All the rooms had gas lighting, all the streets were gaslit, and this was from Ripley's own gasworks on Mill Lane, which was just around the corner from Ripleyville.
Can I ask his gasworks, did that have other functions apart from providing gas to the houses?
It will have been to make gas to sell generally. It wasn't created just for Ripleyville. It was an existing enterprise. So there were 6 end terraced houses, so basically corner terraced houses, which were adjoining Linton Street and 2 adjoining Ellen Street, that were used as retail premises. So these basically got converted into shops and other businesses. So you had a working village that had local businesses in it. But even, I don't think this was for religious reasons, because he wasn't a Quaker or anything like that. It's not, like Salt. But Ripley would not allow the sale of beer in Ripleyville. And I'm not entirely sure where he was coming from. It may simply be that he thought that would be more trouble than it was worth.
Historically, through your talks, drink has been...
Oh yes, drink was the evil, wasn't it?
Historical.
Yes, yes, definitely.
There was a big temperance movement at the time.
Yes, definitely.
But he would have liked to drink, wouldn't he?
Oh yeah.
It's like salty.
Yeah.
He didn't practice what he preached.
Yeah. And my understanding is as well that although this was a rule that he laid down, I think there was still the sale of alcohol in some of these business premises in Ripleyville. They just probably did it a little bit on the quiet. But there was no pub in Ripleyville anyway. There was never a pub built. So, 3 types of housing. Type 1 had frontages of 16'7", depth of 28 feet. They had 2 large ground floor rooms, a scullery at the back, which was in an extension, and there would be a kitchen with a sink and range and a WC and a coal store in the cellar, which was a heck of a lot nicer than conditions people would usually expect. Type 2 was a little bit smaller in front, 15'9", and also it wasn't as deep, depth of 24 feet. 1 large ground floor room to the, a large ground floor room to the front rather, and a smaller one to the back. And again, basement with storage cellar, WC and coal store. Type 3 had 16'7" frontages again, but was now only a depth of 20 feet, a single ground floor through room, which is actually what I was thinking about before, small scullery, storage cellar, coal store, but there was no toilet, which was a bit of a glaring omission, really. It was
It's quite staggering, really. Spending the first 14 years of my life in Miami Flats, that a century earlier would have been a height of luxury.
Yes.
So did they have middens then at the time?
Well, middens was a
Early?
common thing generally, wasn't it?
Oh, right.
In other places you'd get the soilmen coming
Yeah.
along to
Right.
empty them. I would imagine that type 3 would have probably had to have resorted to something like that. It just seems bizarre that he went to the lengths of putting a WC in these other 2 types, but they're not in this. But this is not the only anomaly with Ripleyville, sadly. So, 1868, he donated some of the land to the Church of England, and they agreed to build a church on the site. This isn't the church, this is the vicarage. So St Bartholomew's Church was consecrated in 1872. So no pub, but you got a church. 1875, a vicarage was finished, and again this was on donated land. So there was a home for the occupant vicar. 1881, 10 almshouses were built on a plot close to the vicarage. Does anybody know what almshouses are?
Given to the poor.
Yeah.
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 You had a criteria to meet. for you
That's
to be
right,
accepted into the almshouses, which there are still some in
Yes.
Bradford.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, they quite often get built as a terrace. They weren't usually very big, but they were essentially, I suppose, a bit like social housing in its time, really. But you had to meet a certain criteria in order to be offered one. So once this was done, basically Ripleyville was finished. The architecture of the area didn't really change that much for the rest of its existence. So by 1881, we're done, basically. Ripleyville, finished.
Which people were eligible to live there?
I actually do not know. You mean in the almshouses, or you mean
In any of it.
Well, we'll come on to that. Yes, yes. And that's a really good point, actually, because most model villages built houses for the workers of a particular employer and their families. And some of them may, in some circumstances, allow the families to continue to live there after they cease working, but generally speaking, that it's housing for their workforces, because they pay them and then take the rent back again straight away. It's different with Ripleyville. Yeah. Most of the model working villages, that's the norm. Housing is provided for the workers and their families for them to rent.
It was only about 50% in Saltaire that were working at the mill.
Right, okay. But that will have been the aim when it was started. Now, it was a bit different in two ways. Firstly, Ripley was absolutely on a mission that his workers were not going to rent the houses, they were going to buy the houses. Now, this is at a time when the norm for working people, particularly unskilled or semi-skilled working people, is to rent, and culturally it was to rent. And the whole idea of having to buy a house and having the responsibility for a house was quite alien as a concept. You know, perhaps some more of the skilled working classes, the trades, may have started to go into that. I mean, a lot of them became landlords of pubs and things like that as well. But generally speaking, most working class people would not seriously entertain the idea of getting a mortgage and buying a house. And the other side of it was whether or not anybody would actually lend them the money in the first place. There was a building society movement, but still, you would have to be able to show that you could afford to repay the mortgage. So that was one difference. And then the other difference is that he actually eventually sold much of this housing to non-workers, who then just became investor landlords and tenanted their new properties. And a lot of the social problems that we were experiencing in these other slum areas, which were dominated by private landlords, they just started to become replicated in Ripleyville. So Ripley himself arranged for mortgage finance to be made available for his worker tenants. And there were two options. So you could outright purchase the property, or you could purchase a share of the property and rent the rest. So this is something that happens quite a lot today, this shared ownership idea, where say you buy half of a property and then you rent the other half. And it's usually from a registered social landlord. So it was quite radical, really. It was quite before his time. But there were very few actually purchased through this, and so and those that were mostly then converted to retail use rather than used as a home. And eventually the rental purchase option was abandoned because there was just not really the demand for it. And this was one of the many issues with Ripleyville. Ripley really misunderstood that, that what it would be to be a working class person living in one of these houses, and what their expectations would be realistically, what their aspirations would be. And it was being very unrealistic. And also the other problem was that the take-up of the rented houses was very slow. Because simply, he built these lovely houses, but then the rents he was charging were regarded as being extortionate. So what you ended up with was houses of multiple occupancy. So you started to get, again, overcrowding, perhaps not to the same degree as in some other places. Like in Broomfield you had multiple families living in cellars and stuff like that, and with more security than just paying some money for the night, and then not knowing whether or not you've got a floor to sleep on that next night. But the 1870 census showed that 17 of these properties were unoccupied, and 24 of them were in multiple occupation. He didn't really make it easy. Now, by this time, Ripley was active as a politician on the national stage. He'd been elected as a Bradford MP in 1868. I think that then got overturned by a petition. I'm not quite sure what the grounds were, but and then again he was elected in 1874. I think he started off as a Liberal politician and then he went across to the Conservative Party. Anyway, his attention was far more on national politics at this time than it was about Ripleyville itself. Now, Henry Ripley died in 1882. His son, also Henry, I don't know why they couldn't think of another name, succeeded him. I found it really, really confusing. You know, were you talking about that Henry or that? So his son Henry succeeded him as the manager of the dye works, but most of his estate, which included the Ripleyville model village, was handed to a trust. There was a body of trustees that was called the Ripley Trust that then took on their management. Months after Henry Ripley died, the chimney at Newlands Mill collapsed. So this was part of the Ripley Mills complex, and it killed 54 people, and this included children. Now, surprise, surprise, given that he was part of the good and the great in Bradford at that time, or he had been, a jury at the subsequent inquest exonerated him. But the Telegraph and Argus absolutely savaged him. They blamed him for it. They decided that the way the chimney was constructed was unsafe, and apparently it had been done under his close instruction as well, so it's not like he'd had a hands-off role in its creation. So, 1896, Midland Railway has an Act of Parliament passed to extend their line at Royston to connect with Bradford Market Street, which is now Bradford Foster Square. This proposed line would pass through Ripleyville, so it basically would be pretty much the end of Ripleyville. Despite objections from the Trust, this has already been passed as this Act, so it essentially then mandates the railway company to build this line. There was an arbitration hearing which confirmed, the Midland Railway could go ahead with it, but awarded the Trust £14,000. Now, another Act of Parliament was passed in 1912, and these plans are abandoned at that stage. But Bradford Corporation decided to buy up all the land that the Midland Railway had taken ownership of. And it wasn't actually just Ripleyville, there were other stretches of land down in Broomfields which they basically just bought it all. Bradford Corporation was very upset at the Midland Railway. They really wanted the Crossrail to happen. They were very, very disappointed that it didn't happen. And in some respects, it's a shame that one way or another there wasn't a Crossrail.
So why didn't it happen then? Because obviously there's quite a long time between those 2 days.
It seems to be that the economy changed. There wasn't as much money around, and the Midland Railway's attitude changed towards it. So it went from being perhaps an attractive proposition to being an unattractive one. I mean, it's not untypical of the railway companies. They would quite often get an act passed to give them the right to build a line, and then later on think, actually, that wasn't a good idea. 1899, the ownership of Bowling Dye Works changes. It passes to the Bradford Dyers Association. So from this point onwards, members of the Ripley family basically ceased to have any involvement with the Ripleyville area. So there was still the Ripley Trust, but the Ripley Trust was made up of people who were not members of the Ripley family, and they didn't own any of the businesses anymore in the area either. So they now have no involvement whatsoever. So you now have a situation where Ripleyville's rented houses are divided between 2 landlords. So you've got the Ripley Trust, and then you've got Bradford Corporation. And they don't really talk to one another very well. They don't really come up with any sort of general agreement about how they could collectively manage the village. Both of them do come up with policies of maintaining the properties on the minimum amount of money possible.
Well, there you go.
Nothing new.
So what happens?
Yeah.
Any guesses as to what happens to the properties?
They'll start falling
They all
apart.
start falling apart. Yes.
Which is a shame.
It's an absolute shame. So, and the other thing is as well, many of the streets were never adopted in Ripleyville. So you had, and there was no electricity supplied to the area until 1938, which I understand was a bit later than some other parts of Bradford. So it had really gone from this utopic dream, it was rapidly declining into something that was more hellish, really. As you can see here. 1960s, some of the houses are still using gas lighting, and basically it just looks neglected, it looks run down, it does not look like an attractive neighbourhood at all. It's a far cry from the vision that Henry Ripley had originally had for it.
So the school had been closed earlier in the century? I
Um,
mean, that was...
yes, I think so.
That's probably during demolition now.
That will be during the demolition. The school, actually, I think the school may have ended up being passed on to the council to manage or something like that, or the school board. I'm afraid I don't actually know precisely when it closed, but it didn't last the test of time anyway. In fact, almost nothing of Ripleyville lasted the test of time. 1951, Bradford Corporation adopted a development plan, and their vision was the areas that are immediately surrounding the city centre, particularly around the sort of southern bit of the city centre, would become light industrial rather than residential. So places like Berksland, New Leeds, Broomfields and Ripleyville. So these areas that are sort of bordering on West Bowling, East Bowling and Barker End. So it got caught up within that. And a process began in the late 50s to start demolishing Ripleyville. And this was completed by 1970. There are a few exceptions, so the almshouses still exist as far as I understand. But other than that, there isn't really anything left of Ripleyville, which is a real shame. You know, this was Bradford's model industrial village. And, you know, consider this and then you look over at places like Croydon and Saltaire and think, well, it could have happened differently. You know, I don't know how much has been more luck than anything, particularly for Saltaire when you consider some of the plans. You know, Bradford Council wanted to demolish Salts Mill, didn't they? Once it ceased to be a working mill in the 80s, which is, you know, it's a crime that someone would even consider that. And it was only really because of Jonathan Silver and the arts movement.
They say that he paid a penny for it.
Right, it must have needed a lot. It would have been a money pit, you know. If he'd have succeeded, he would have probably been regarded as a great man. But because he tried and failed, opinions get divided a bit, you know. Which is in some ways is a shame because, you know, I don't know whether it's this British or English culture of you know, not giving credit to people for at least having a go and trying, you know. But anyway, the fact is opinions are mixed regarding Henry Ripley. So it has to be said he did plough an enormous amount of money and his time and energy into having the first and only model village in Bradford built. And, you know, some people are cynical about this, but, you know, it did, at least in its origins, have the idea of improving living conditions for working people. The housing itself was far superior to nearly anything else that was available at the time for working people. Now, I've just said that. And he built a school in the village, he built a church, he allowed the introduction of retail businesses into the village, so it was actually a properly functioning village. It wasn't just an area of housing, it had more to it than that.
Unlike a lot of modern developments.
Yes.
Just loads and loads of houses.
Just houses.
Yes.
That's
Built on floodplains.
yes. Oh yes, yes. Now, definitely he was wrong with a lot of his ideas. You know, his vision of this property-owning working class, it didn't pan out. But it could have been naivety. It could have been a sign of perhaps someone who was before their time. The intentions were good, I would say, but perhaps how it was exercised was not. On the other hand, it's been said that his primary motivation was his political career. Once he got to a certain point within his business career, so building Ripleyville, being seen to help the working classes, was more important than actually helping them. That's a countercharge that often gets put his way. And examples of evidence, if you like, backing that up is the unaffordable rent levels, and that resulted in some overcrowding as the only way for people to afford to live there by sharing properties. The poor state of the environment around Ripleyville, the streets were never adopted. It wasn't a particularly nice environment, and that his business used unsafe construction methods. Maybe that also could have extended to the quality of these properties as well. So there's this counter-argument that perhaps he wasn't as committed to social progress as much as he stated that he was, because of these shortcomings. I suppose the truth is probably going to be a bit of both, really. We're not perfect as humans. We can have more than one motivation for doing something. You could probably argue that with anybody who does anything of great social value, that actually because they're going to get some fame out of it or whatever else, that it's not the only motivation, and maybe, but I suppose in the end what really matters is the result of what you do, really.
You could argue the same about salt, couldn't you?
Yeah.
He's benefited everything that he did. It wasn't just for benefit of his staff.
Yeah. Well, absolutely.
I mean, like his hospital was there, so the workers got back to work quickly.
Yes.
That was his motivation.
As I said in one of the previous sessions, I think a couple of times actually now, about William Foster, who's credited for the Education Act that brought school boards in and elementary schools universally. And he's someone who's regarded as a great philanthropist and social progressor. But actually, there's a lot of evidence that he was responding to lobbying from industry, that we needed more educated workforces. So there was an economic argument. I suppose in the end it depends upon which side you want to choose, or maybe just settle with the reality if it's more than one thing.
But if you look at that, that's a good thing either way, isn't it?
Exactly. Yes. So it still benefits people, doesn't it, from being educated. But yes, I would say that Ripley was more than one thing. So whether Ripleyville was a failed experiment, the main, one of his big motivations was to get him to Parliament to further his political career. It will have provided some good to people along the way. Even if people had to share properties, renting. The environments of those properties, the sizes of those properties would have been so much better than other alternatives that were commonly around at the time. Now, we'll have a bit of time at the end for discussion and questions and things, but I just want to go over a couple of other things connected with Ripleyville. So firstly, there's the other Ripleyville, which often if you put Ripleyville into Google, this comes up rather than the model industrial village. And isn't it lovely? Actually, I don't think it exists anymore. So 1976, the Ripleyville estate, which was a social housing estate, was built. Although it wasn't on the site of Ripleyville, it was slightly away from the original Ripleyville model village.
Was this behind the Red Gin? Sort of more
Yeah,
towards
more down
Manchester
that way.
Yeah.
Now,
Newby Square,
Yes. Yeah.
Springville Street.
Springville.
Yeah.
there's a very loose connection with Ripleyville. There's a loose argument, rather, as to why they decided to call it Ripleyville. But it wasn't built on the site of the Ripleyville model village. Now, I haven't been able to find out whether it was Bradford Council or whether it was another social landlord that built this.
It was council originally.
Was it council originally? Because it's Accent Housing now that apparently have been involved more recently. But
I
there
didn't
it
realise it
is.
was so recent, 1976. I
Sorry.
didn't realise it was so recent that had been built.
Yeah, yes. It hasn't stood the test of time.
It's all gone now.
Yes,
But
thank goodness. So it was a complex of 163 homes, and it made use of what was called the Radburn design. So it's like a courtyard system. Houses face each other. They have shared gardens or yards. So the theory is that because you have a shared bit of land outside, people go out and they mix and they get on with one another, and it creates this community spirit, and it's so totally naive.
Yes.
You know, if people go looking to, say, buy a property or rent a property, if there's a common garden as part of it that they've got to share with other tenants or other property holders, usually that puts people off. Because we like our privacy, and quite rightly, we want to be able to go, you know, out into a garden or a yard and just be on our own and not have to engage, you know. I mean, I'm not against people getting to know one another, but you can't force it. You know, it will happen organically if people get on with one another rather than this sort of nanny idea. This Radburn design, which was wonderful, was the reason that this estate was dubbed as being utopic, because it was going to create a utopic community. Like Ripleyville, the whole same idea. Anyway, the reality was slightly different. So the area ended up with crime and antisocial behaviour, but the construction quality of these properties was terrible, particularly insulation of these properties. I mean, nowadays with the building regulations we have, if they'd have built these, the council would have told them to tear them down, or they should have done at least. They were cold, they were damp, and of course, if you don't insulate a property well enough, it's not just that it leaks heat, it's also sound leaking as well. If you're living in flats, it's one of the worst things if you've got a neighbour above you or below you who just plays music quite loud or wherever. It's quite intrusive. So, we're going to go apparently from that to this, but as you can see, this is computer generated, this isn't actually bricks and mortar. There's always a few people walking around looking happy as well. I'm surprised there isn't a cyclist going past as well, because that's usually a key thing that you...
What's that? Oh no, sorry. From here it looks like a bit of a scooter type, but it's not.
It's a motorbike, I think. Oh, actually, it might be an e-bike, so it's
E-bike.
really on trend, yeah. E-bike.
No cars.
No car. Well, that's the thing, isn't it? No car. So, 2023, Accent Housing began demolishing this estate, and the plan is to replace it with 73 houses. They'll all be rented out. They will be allegedly affordably rented out. But they will be different types of housing to appeal to different people. So some for singles and couples, some for families, some for older people. To try and actually create more of a mixed community. And the allegedly Accents are going to exceed the building regulations in terms of the insulation. So probably you'll find at the height of summer you're having to open all of your doors and windows because it's so hot inside. Anyway, the idea behind this, I'm not doing this in order to promote what Accent does, by the way. It's just it's an interesting side because they decided to call the area Ripleyville, and apparently they're still going to call this new development Ripleyville. The idea is it's going to have a
Is that
positive
giving the kiss of
impact.
death, bearing in mind what's happened.
Yeah, it is.
It's like calling a ship Titanic, isn't it?
If you progressively lasts a shorter length of time, because the first one lasted 100 years, the second one 50 years, this one might last 25.
Yeah. Well, time will tell, won't it? Yeah. They'll probably just. I imagine that probably the name will just fall out of use over time, as seems to be the case with so many places. But yeah, part of the idea is to try and uplift the improvement, the physical appearance of this area as well. Another aside is a district called Little India. Now, has anybody heard of Little India?
No.
No.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, it's sort of opposite Stevens Road going down here, isn't it?
Where is St Stephen's Road?
From Manchester Road, and get to where the big red bridge is.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, if you're going up and turn left there, St Stephen's Road, before you get to West Bolton.
That's
Right down that area.
Okay.
Your sister had done some Stevens Road.
Well, arguably this isn't city centre, it's sort of out of city centre, but it does. Again, it is an area where the name has fallen out of use, although there has been a lot of changes in the area.
Is that on Bay Street?
Yes, yes. So, it was really an area of West Bowling towards Manchester Road and towards city centre, outside the city centre. The name came into play by the late 19th century. There's references to it. Carries on into the early 20th century, then seems to fall out of use. And the names of the streets in the area are the reason that the area got its name. So Calcutta Street and Bombay Street and other examples of there were other districts like Lower Manchester Road, which I'll talk briefly about this afternoon at the end, which had names of places as well from the empire. It wasn't a very big district, but it was really the names of these streets is where the name come from, rather than, for instance, the population of the area or anything like that. Now, the connection with Ripleyville is with the original Ripleyville, not the Ripleyville Mark II, or Mark III even. The land that Little India was built on was sold to developers by the Ripley family because it was surplus land that they held. Now, it's arguable the housing that was constructed was inferior to that which was put up in Ripleyville itself. And again, sometimes some writers have argued this is yet more evidence that Ripley wasn't that committed to social progress, because he had this land he didn't know what to do with, so he just sold it, and some housing that wasn't particularly big and became a bit overcrowded was built on it instead. So why did he not use it for something else? Or why did he not make sure that whoever bought it and built housing was going to do it to a better standard? Anyway, that's where the connection comes in. But it is again another area which people don't talk about anymore, and most people wouldn't know ever existed in Bradford. So, got to a point now where I'm going to ask you if anybody's got any questions, or if anybody's got any comments or anything they would like to share about any of